I'm Lori Mulberg, and I'm the Director of Alumni Relations for the College of Design, and I'll just be hanging out here in the background to help administer the event today. Before we get started, I'd like to offer just a few little tips to help things run smoothly. So this meeting is being recorded, and we're going to share it after the event. If you don't want to be recorded today, please just go ahead and click the camera icon below left, and you can turn off your video and just opt for chat instead of audio when you're having a full group conversation. Individual breakout room conversations will not be recorded, so feel free to use video and audio freely in those spaces. You'll notice that we have muted everyone by default to start. This just helps us avoid disruptions from late entries, and it also keeps the audio quality high for everyone. So please keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking. Go ahead and use the chat feature below to share comments and questions with the group or privately with individual attendees throughout the meeting. And if you'd like, you can see the names of the other participants by clicking on the participant icon below. So if you spot a friend there in the list, go ahead, send them a private hello, and we'll get started. Our chat moderators today are Tom Fisher and Virajita Singh, and they will monitor and address comments and questions from the chat during the designated portions of the meeting. This program is also eligible for one AIA Learning Unit, Health, Safety, and Welfare. And so if you would like that, you must attend the full session to qualify. Today, that is 65 minutes or more. We will send certificates of participation for others who don't need the AIA credit, and AIA credit will also be reported for members within 2 weeks of the event. So now I'd like to get started, and I'll introduce our series hosts. This program was created by 3 of our faculty members. Today we have Abby Asojo, Associate Dean for Research, Creative Scholarship and Engagement, and a Professor for Interior Design, and she's going to serve as our topic and discussion host today. Tom Fisher is the Director of the Minnesota Design Center, a former Dean of the college, and a Dayton Hudson Chair in Urban Design. And Virajita Singh is our Associate Vice Provost for the Office of Equity and Diversity, and she's also an Adjunct Assistant Professor and Senior Research Fellow focused on design for community resilience with the Center for Sustainable Building Research. And Tom and Virajita are our chat moderators. And finally, our featured discussion leaders today, Anna Pravanata. She's a principal with Alliance and also the president-elect of AIA Minnesota. And we have Lissa Washington, who is president of NOMA and an architecture project manager with Formula Architecture. So with that, I'll hand it over to Abby.
Welcome, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Design in the Post-Pandemic World series. We set up this session to create a forum where we all can come together to talk about the disruptions that we're experiencing during this global pandemic. We want to have conversations of how we can co-imagine our post-pandemic future. And we want to use design as a platform to identify ways to support positive change through new types of collaboration and design solutions. We also want to find ways of thinking together about design in our lives and in our various organizations. This is the second one we're offering in this series. The first one focused on the workplace, and today we're going to focus on educational spaces. So just to give you like a brief overview of what we're going to cover today, we're going to have the topic introduced by our guests today, Anna Pravanati and Lissa Washington. And from about 3:05, we'll focus on the topic, and then we'll move on to the opening discussions with the speakers, and then we'll go to a breakout session where we'll be in small groups, and then we'll come back together as a full group and share ideas and focus on insights and come up with some ideas together. And then at 4:10, we'll have some closing thoughts and focus on some action steps and some next steps. So I'd like to hand you over to Anna Pravanati, who's the president of the AIA, for the next part of the session. Next slide, please, Laurie.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to speak in front of all of you. So the COVID-19 pandemic has created unprecedented challenges for higher education to rapidly pivot to online learning just to sustain the learning process. Schools were shut down in a matter of days to comply with stay-at-home order, and instructors had to scramble changing the class delivery to all online delivery. So this summer, a group of us at Alliance were able to have conversations with instructors from design studios and science teaching. So these two types of curriculum require hands-on, on-site collaborative learning for some portion of the class. So we were curious how they're planning to teach their classes in the fall. And, you know, to our surprise, all of them said that they still cannot figure out how online environment can give that tactile hands-on learning, such as touching dinosaur eggs, smelling diesel fumes, or making physical models. And also that collaborative, serendipitous interactions that oftentimes result in innovations. But they said there are some technology benefits that they were able to reap from this pandemic. They were able to leverage the use of readily available online tools, such as Google Earth. They used that tool to analyze Mississippi River. And of were done through Zoom, some of the studio instructors were able to invite crits from other parts of the country. And, you know, and they said once the pandemic is done, they will continue some of the positive things, such as pre-recording lectures, and let the students watch them online and on their own time. Students can watch the lectures over and over again and ask questions for specific portion that they don't understand. So they see a lot of benefits in like pre-recorded lectures like that. And then, you know, the hands-on activities and collaborative discussions will need to still happen on site because, you know, online learning cannot really replace that aspect of learning. If a class is all lecture, it is possible to make it all online, which then makes it more accessible to a lot more students. And I just heard recently that Big Ten schools recently announced online course sharing program. So, you know, this kind of initiative, like the big universities, will increase, I hope, will increase flexibility, the ability of college. And, you know, hybrid learning will also change how we use learning spaces. Lecture halls may not be needed as much, but we may see an increase in multi-dimensional learning environment. And you might wonder, what is a multi-dimensional learning space? And we feel like it is a learning environment with robust audio, visual, and technology to allow for remote learning, augmented or virtual reality, as well as active on-site collaborative learning. This type of learning will allow that virtual connections to people on the other side of the world, as well as providing a physical space for collaborative interactions between students and instructors. So, you know, this is just kind of like some nuggets to start the discussion today, and I'm looking forward to discuss all of this with you later. And now Lisa will touch on the students and their experience. Thank you.
I said a lot without even unmuting myself, amazingly enough. But thank you, Anna. What I wanted to start with was talking about caring for the whole person and caring for the whole student. We quickly moved to this model. I think it was a lot easier for certain colleges and universities and in certain areas, and able to connect in this way became kind of pretty seamless. I actually was able to participate in a class this spring, and it was nice to be able to interact with students, and I think you get to know a little bit more about them because of the back and forth exchange and just the idea of where they were. We spent a lot of time talking about where they ended up having to pretty much vacate campus. So with this technology, and I think we can probably move the next slide forward. It works for some. It doesn't necessarily work for all. I mean, I think to create equitable access, colleges and universities are going to have to start pivoting towards providing laptops or iPads for students to have all the software necessary for learning. But we do miss a little bit of the support services, and those things still are vitally important to the continued education and support of our students. I was just reading a poll today that said that, I think about 2/3 of students still felt supported by administration and their professors. But I think some, people are missing out on some of that interpersonal things. And there's also financial challenges with moving to this remote model. I think, each school is handling things differently. I was looking at an article just a couple hours ago about how UNC Chapel Hill, they opened their campus August 10th, and now they are sending students back home, undergraduate students, because they had a slight outbreak. But we find that in some schools, particularly HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, sometimes having this equitable access is not as easy. Morehouse College is seeing a 25% drop in enrollment. We can move on to the next slide. I think, like I was saying, schools are prioritizing incoming freshmen at some schools versus outgoing seniors. School to school, across campuses across the same cities and same states are going to full on instruction. Some are able to pivot quickly to continue this model of remote. But having those tools beyond the laptop and computer, having internet access is a big deal. For some students, having residence and dining hall and having a place to live, this is sometimes students that are aging out of foster care, or they don't have a place to go home, and there's just new and additional stresses of being wherever home was. I think that it happens quite a bit in BIPOC communities. Schools are now adopting strict coronavirus prevention as parts of codes of conduct. Gatherings like parties and things like that, campuses across the country are starting to shut off-campus parties down, but they have their work cut out for them. I think my big question and my big takeaway is, how do we support and create a well-rounded student experience from all of this?
Anna and Alyssa, this is Tom Fisher. Thank you. And for all of our participants, if you have questions, we have about 15 minutes before we go into breakout rooms. Ask them in the chat. So I will ask my first question, which is, what do you think the long-term effects of this hybrid remote learning situation will be? How much of it will last after the pandemic? And what impact do you think an ongoing hybrid education will have on the need for educational facilities as well as their design? Any thoughts about that?
I think, that hybrid learning will require architects and designers to really think what makes students or faculty want to be on campus, right? What kind of spaces and what kind of environment that makes people want to congregate and come on campus. Because, we know that technology can support communication, webinar or Zoom call or things like that. But, that connection is hard to get. Like a virtual connection, you kind of need to be physical on campus. But I think, it will put a pressure on us as architects and designers really think about what makes a campus desirable, to be in, faculty and students to come back in.
It would be interesting to see, because one component, I'm taking just the other approach than Anna, because she's quite the expert. But what the approach would be for larger just community and figuring out community and interaction as students are matriculating. I think that, crafting those types of spaces are going to be important too. I mean, right now they're adapting dorms to, provide for less students, putting in plexiglass, showers, assigning showers to certain students. So I think that it'll be interesting. I think it's going to be a challenge, but I think, much like you've talked about the workplace environment, I think we're just going to be touched in every aspect of this for the long haul, and it'll be interesting to see 20 years from now what normal is.
We have several students on in the webinar. Do any of you have any thoughts about your experience as students going through this, and any thoughts about the long-term impact this might have? Does anyone want to either unmute themselves or put something in the chat? No. Well, students can be shy. So
I have a question, may
Okay.
I ask? I also see there are some faculty as well, and I wondered if there were experiences in the recent months that actually shared how students are actually learning in these environments. I think one of the notions that seems to be present, at least this semester when I was part of teaching, is that it's a hybrid environment. I mean, our home spaces have now become much more present, and we spend a lot of time online as well. So it's just shifted how we do things. And I've heard of instances of students connecting from just different locations, or sometimes being in transit even as they take classes and so on. And so I just wondered if there were some insights from people who have been teaching, and especially for the students too, as you engage in the last few months in learning.
Well, maybe I'll just mention that Vrajit and I just got done teaching a class this summer remotely on the post-pandemic world. And one of the things we learned from our students is they really like to work in teams when they're working virtually, because they're all feeling very isolated. And so actually having them work in team projects was something that they really valued, because it gave them a smaller group of people that they could continually interact in. And so I think this idea of every student working by themselves may be less common, and more about learning how to do teamwork, which I think we think is a valuable skill for them to learn anyway. So.
Right.
So following along that lines, I'm wondering, Tom, how, we can create a sense of belonging in a virtual environment. You mentioned putting students in team and working together. I'm curious if any of our attendees have like suggestions or recommendations for how to create this sense of belonging in a virtual environment.
Am I unmuted, Ms. Marvin Meltzer? Tom, how are you? Adam, how you doing? I have a question. I'm from a whole different generation, so as I watch this, I just wonder what this whole process, I mean, the design process is obviously dependent upon sort of free thinking and being loose in a way without a lot of restrictions, and what you're trying to do and how your mind works, and not too many rules. Let me put it this way. And I don't work on the computer. I still draw by hand. But I'm wondering, and I've been on a few webinars, do all these rules and rigid ways of doing things, have you found that in this design process, has this impacted your kids or the students' ability to let their minds go and be free in what they're coming up with and what they're thinking about?
Marvin, yeah, Rajita, go ahead.
I was going to say, we are just wrapping up our class, and I would say it hasn't. In fact, we were, so happy to see, and Tom, you should add what your perspectives, but we were so happy to see that, in fact, at this time when creativity is needed, it's alive and well in the minds and hearts of our students. And the teams generated excellent ideas. We also had excellent input from reviewers. Some of, at least I saw Rob Gradewell on here. And so I think we were able to create an exchange and just the development of the idea. And it seems like one of the ideas that was really prominent in the class was, because it was focused on the post-pandemic or, sort of pandemic response, that the students were actually feeling energized by the idea that they were solving a real life problem that was around them and that they could contribute. And that seems significant.
That's interesting, because my son is working with me, and he knows all the technology, and I'm kind of lucky that I have sort of lived through this whole generation of at a time when everybody drew by hand to a time now where almost nobody draws by hand.
Right.
And it's been fascinating for me to see how facile and how creative you can be with all this technology, and how it's being used. And my son has really shown me that. And sometimes I just kind of follow along.
Yeah.
But anyway, but that was one of my thoughts, and you responded to it. I'm sure you guys are all on top of that, and it's a whole new world out there.
Yeah, thank you, Marvin. I mean, one of the other things we've learned is that this technology and this situation raises the question of who's our students, what is the classroom, who are our reviewers? As Rajita said, we were able to bring reviewers from all over the country. We never could have afforded to fly them all in, but on this technology, as we have in this webinar, we have people from all over the country here.
Right.
It also raises the question, why do we think of students only being 20-year-olds? I mean, why can't this technology really allow people of all ages to dip in to education as they need it? And why do we have to think about the campus as the container of education? So I think it's really going to have a profound effect on how we think about the educational enterprise, where it happens, who's part of it. And I think there's a dramatic need to greatly improve access, greatly reduce the cost of education, and make education available to everybody, anywhere, all the time.
Right.
Thanks,
Thank you. I see a question. Abby, were you going to look at the question?
I was going to
Great.
take us to the breakout rooms, but I'll go ahead and take that question.
Yeah, I'm just looking at a couple threads in the chat. One of them, Sean has raised, curious about who some of the institutions are nationally and internationally that you feel are raising the bar and addressing this new normal. And I don't know, Anna and Lisa, if there are other examples that come to mind. I do feel myself that everybody's figuring it out in their own customized way, so there's no one or two leaders. But Anna and Lisa?
I think that's right. I think everybody is trying. We talked to a couple of mechanical engineer instructors, and what they came up with, like take-home kits. So they send experiment kits to students in the beginning of class and let students do it themselves in house instead of doing it as a group. So the good thing about it, yes, it reduces kind of like the amount of collaborative work, But the good thing about that, you know, in a group, usually there are 1 or 2 students that just kind of like sit back and let everybody else do the work. You know, with this kind of like take-home kits, everybody is required to do the experiment. Everybody needs to like understand what the process is. So, you know, this specific instructor feels good about that, you know, that, you know, now students learn better because they cannot rely on the group, on their group mates, you know. So that's kind of like, yeah, so that's an interesting part coming out of this pandemic.
Yeah, that's great.
Also, Paul's question was wondering, given the evaluating the investment and return on investment for design education, he couldn't rationalize anything other than a completely virtual pathway. Any thoughts about the cost of education, the return on investment, and how this situation, how remote learning might change that? Lisa?
I was thinking about the emotional cost of studio and those late nights and the early mornings and learning everybody's flow. That was where my gut went. Financially, I think it's beautiful and amazing, and yeah. I think that's a real opportunity. It could go that way.
Yeah. Anna, okay.
Lisa,
yeah, Jim, go ahead.
I was interested in the study you or the report that you referenced about University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and they're closing down after a week of opening up. And I understand most of the issue there was with fraternities and sororities. And I'm wondering if places like fraternities and sororities and the rental properties that students live in pose an opportunity for colleges of design to have some real life experience with how do you help groups like that maneuver and prepare for a healthy living environment.
I think that'd be amazing. I mean, we're here to try to solve real world problems, and so I think there are truly opportunities there, but there's also that social component, and how do we really, it's a balance of monitoring that, and you know, and I guess how do campus authorities regulate that with everything else.
Well, good. Why don't we move into breakout rooms? And I've put up on the chat the question we'd like everyone to look at, which is how will teaching and learning change over the next 5 to 10 years, and what effect it will have on educational spaces. I've also put in the link to slides. So we want each breakout group to have somebody who is trying to capture the sort of main points on the slides so that we can capture them, and also identify somebody in your group willing to report out when we get back together.
So Tom, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I just added some, it again for some people who've just joined, because I think they can see the previous chat. Also, there's some prompts there about aspects that you might consider, you know, shifts with technology and design of educational spaces and support for hybrid learning experiences and so on. So just to start you thinking about it.
So we really want you to focus when you get to the breakout rooms on this particular main question of how teaching and learning will change over the next 5 to 10 years and drive the post-pandemic design of educational spaces and experiences long-term. So long-term are what we really want to grapple with this afternoon. And we have like 5 prompts that we created that, you know, we want you to focus on: shifts in technology and online tools, design of educational spaces, and support for hybrid learning, and promoting equitable access and caring for the whole person. So Laurie will get us to our breakout rooms, and there will be a session host in each breakout room. But
Jim, if you're back on, you were making a great point. I just wanted to share that with you.
Many of us left mid-sentence, so.
So we were pulled back into the main room. Is that what happened?
That's right.
Yes.
That's what happened.
That's right.
Okay. We were still, in our group having a wonderful conversation because we have Dimitros is joining us from Greece. I think he's the furthest person.
And we have someone from Japan as well.
Oh, we have somebody from Japan. Okay. Yeah. So, yeah.
Just saying, we're worldwide
We
now.
have global representation today then. Yeah, yeah. So since we're back in, I'll just wait for a few seconds for people to join back into the discussion. We're at this point where we might invite various groups to share one idea or insight. It could be via chat, and feel free to unmute yourself to speak and share some of the discussions you had in your group.
So Abby, do you want to just go down the groups? Why don't we
Yes,
start
I
with group
welcome-
one?
What about breakout room 1? I will find, there are no names there, but breakout room 1.
Okay, so I think we were in breakout room 1. So,
Go for it, Anna.
but
Yes,
okay, but some of the things that we talked about is, it will change from teaching to active learning by students. It's revolutionized the way of learning. Students could actively seek a teacher or a course they want to learn, so they're not like tied down to like one institution. They can just like Google, the thing they want to learn from the faculty that they like. Okay, so they can choose faculty from Greece or Japan if they're in Minnesota. So that will kind of like change, students are more in the driver's seat for their education. So that one, and then the second one is virtual learning gets pushed harder, for safety, and also it's to alleviate institutions from like making policies such as where and when to wear masks and things like that. Okay, and then also, from a practice point of view, like an architectural practice, we still miss that hands-on collaborative sketching together over the BOMWOT. We still miss that. So I think one of us, Jill, she designs online learning, and she's willing to share maybe 1 or 2 tips of how to incorporate collaboration or communication into online learning. So Jill?
Sure, I'll just briefly, just a couple of things that our group does and in the classes we design is just starting with video introductions, even in asynchronous courses, so that everybody gets a name and a face and a voice, if that's applicable. And we can still do group projects, we can still do recorded group presentations, we can still give feedback to each other. So there's we have a whole library of assignment types that would foster collaboration and communication, even in asynchronous delivery. So I hope that those kinds of things will expand even after the pandemic passes.
I want to welcome someone from breakout room 6 to comment, because we had a fascinating discussion there. We had a medical doctor in the group. We had a K through 12 educator. We had practitioners, design practitioners and architects, and we also had an architect from Greece. So I would welcome either, one of our group members in breakout room 6 to comment about some of the discussions we had there around, the intersection between medical, the design of spaces and the actual pandemic that we're facing, and the necessity for designers and designers to work with the scientists. So I think, Paul, I might ask you to share, or Dimitros or Gil.
Yeah, I'm Paul Brewer. I'm an ophthalmologist. I went through a full 4+ years of design training at the U of M from 1971 to 75, and then went on to medical school. But for our breakout room 6, the things that I kind of mentioned is that the kind of global health idea is that although we can take all these remedial steps, which are good and they're necessary, there really won't be a recongregation in the traditional college educational institutional kind of framework until a vaccine is readily available. And that won't be, according to a economist's interview with Bill Gates, who's big into vaccines, as many of you know, until at least the first quarter of 2021. And that's for the kind of richer developing nations. So the second point that I brought up in conjunction with Craig in our group, K through 12 educator, is that some of the spaces that are available for the congregate learning model, because of their age and their vaccination characteristics, are more of a risk than a reward. So those were my observations, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Paul. I wonder, I would like to welcome Breakout Room 2. Virajita, is there someone in that group that wants to share some feedback?
I was in breakout room 4, so.
I was in 2.
Okay, Lissa.
Yes, I had the shy group. I'm going to point you all out. No, I'm kidding. They were great. But I took some of the notes. We talked about that the technology was kind of brought along by force, but it's here forever, and I think everyone responded positively to it and commended kind of the collective whole of being able to rapidly adapt. Jim was just getting to the point where we were starting to talk about accessibility, and he was just kind of getting around to a really good point about that. But we did question about the soft skills and the hands-on training and how that will play into the psyche of actually getting back together and figuring that out, you know, like right now. And I can't remember who it was. I can't remember his name right now because I can't see his face on the screen, but he was talking about how somebody he knows is in medical school and how, you know, they're having to kind of do that through secondhand experience and not getting that soft skill of learning how to use the scalpel in a real world environment. So I think those were the big things that kind of came out of our conversation, and that, you know, this forum and this format, the large lecture hall has kind of gone away, and that this is a great forum for that, and being able to have these Zoom breakout sessions. And I think the longer we start using technologies like Zoom and Teams and things like that, the slicker and slicker they're going to get, and the more and more demands I think we're going to have on them and how they work and how we interact, because everybody was mid-sentence and we went back because we had this time period, and it gives you a nice polite little time, and maybe there's something that, you know, Zoom can do to make it a little bit more apparent we're actually going to stop and cut you off. And so to be able to really capture people and adjust this technology, I think this technology is having to catch up to us pretty soon here, and how we really use it.
Yeah.
Melissa, following on that, I just wanted to note a couple of points that Michael Haggins, who's joining us from Connecticut, made in terms of the question of why do we have a campus? Why is there a campus? And what is the life of the campus? Michael, do you want to say anything about that?
It's a good time to segue into breakout room 4 since Michael was there.
Okay, Michael, go ahead. And
well, yeah, and I don't want to monopolize the time, but briefly I asked what I thought was a provocative question of why campus, and the need for us to think very seriously about that, as in what function does it actually serve? So that's a big point, but one. The second is in terms of what are the changes that will remain a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And we've seen diminished already before pandemic, we saw diminished use and effectiveness of lectures, which is not to mean that people do not speak, as I am, and we could characterize that as a lecture, and we could package it in a variety of ways. But the notion that people go to a room at a designated time to hear someone speak winds up being more of a performance than an educational experience. So if Mark Twain showed up, I'd go listen to him, for example, just to choose one, or listen to an author read from their book. Those are the kinds of events that we might characterize as lectures, but they don't have a place, or we can't. I'm digressing. The point I'm trying to make is that lectures have never been a terribly effective educational device, and as a consequence, those will be diminished, and as a result, the spaces.
And not only diminished, Michael, but also we've discovered in teaching online that you can't really talk more than about 10 or 15 minutes at the absolute maximum.
Right.
Right.
I just have one other point to make that I think gets to the heart of what I think about as being the value of campus, and it has to do with socialization. The social impact of meeting folks who are different than oneself, be that racial, ethnic, or country of origin, or language, has a profound impact on the individual who's open to that. And it also lifts up so many to one of the folks in our group called this the pathways to the future, that lifts folks into the pathways for the future. And the absence of place where individuals can meet does compromise that. And I am concerned about that.
I'd just like, thank you. I'd like to add, just have Anise. I learned Anise was in our group, and of course she leads some of the work with cultural engagement of our students on campus. And so just some insights on that. And I also understand that Sean, who was also in our group, and Anise have collaborated on the design of Kaufman Union. And I wonder what you think about if you had to design it over in this post-pandemic or during pandemic.
Anise, I'd let you answer first if you'd like. Other than doubling the floor plate, that might be nice to have a little more space. But you know, I think, go ahead, Anise, please.
No, you please, you kick it off.
Okay. Well, I just have to put a plug in for Anise. I mean, she made the project successful because of her listening skills. And I think if there's anything that sort of has been bubbling up for me as a designer of space, has been the need for some really, really intentional listening about what human beings need for space, and how they claim space and make room for others. So, you know, I think this has kind of come full circle. It's been there for probably close to 5 or 6 years now. And I check in as often as I can, and I hear that the young men and women are creating and recreating that space within their own suites to sort of fit their needs. So I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn from them, frankly, about how to pivot quickly and make space more acceptable in some ways.
Yeah. And I really don't know how I would redesign the space, because if it's bigger, then more people gather together. If it's smaller spaces, like more small spaces, then you have more people in small spaces together. So I don't know from Des, leaving that up to you all. I have no idea. But it is interesting because our cultural centers are not going to be open. We're going to limit it to 5 officers having access to the space so they can have meetings. But they're not going to be open because even with the perfectly laid plans, they cannot control their constituents. So That's where we're at this year until, you know, things change. Another thing I thought was really interesting, because we've been talking to all the cultural centers, is that when at first we asked them, what are your plans? And they're like, well, we're planning to, you know, we're waiting to see what the university says. And we're like, okay, well, you have to follow CDC guidelines. And there's 9 cultural centers, and they've all said, well, we want you to just tell us what to do. Like, they don't want to interpret these guidelines. And I'm like, okay, well, now we're about to tell them you can't be open. So that's going to bring on something totally different. They're going to find ways to gather. People are going to find ways to gather. That's part of being a student at a Big Ten university. You know, they're not like at Capella. So this has been really hard. So.
It seems a lot of the discussions and the comments people have keep pointing to the fact that we're going to have to continue doing a lot remotely for safety reasons. And it seems we're going to also have to find ways to do this remote work better. I want to invite someone from Breakout Room 3, because that's what's on the Google slide, because they have comments about sense of belonging and some aspects that relate to creating, you know, a sense of belonging and thinking about the whole self. So I wonder if
Go ahead, Marilyn. Marilyn is our reporter.
Terry,
We elected Marilyn.
What we talked about was the sense of community is not there, that we'll probably have to redefine the experience that we have, you know, whether students will find social community and social belonging in other ways than with their classmates. I also think there'll be a big difference between undergraduate and graduate students, because the graduate students that I work with, they have a sense of community that lasts their entire lifetime. They get to know people and they connect with them for a very long period of time. So that we would have to figure that one out. I think another thing that we talked about was how will we know if deep learning is taking place? When you think about just spewing out facts in a lecture, that's not the same thing as redefining the college experience to apply and do critical thinking, that kind of thing. Certainly an advantage is the global access to the expertise that we'll have, and if we can take advantage of that, that will be terrific. Another question that came up in our group was, how can you learn the personal style, the cultural tenure of people if you don't have this multicultural experience? So those were some of the main things. Tom, if you have other suggestions.
You know, just from listening, not being an educator, this strikes me as a total branding campaign. If you had a virtual product, a Netflix network or something where you weren't in a bricks and mortar setting, and you're branding the U of M in all these different aspects of, for undergraduate and graduate, here's our brand. This is what we represent. Motivation, if you can't be motivated to just work on your own, there's a whole system of gamification, of remote atavistic kind of team things that maintain students' motivation to continue with the course. But I think from listening, that is a big kind of a foundational issue for higher education moving forward. And just in the same way that some East Coast IVs have, you know, really worked the brand, and maybe it's like, well, you take some critical research to find out if you have a diploma from those kind of institutions, is it really matter in your professional development or lifelong learning. So this branding of the U of M, I think, would be a prerequisite to even post-pandemic kind of viability for the university.
You know, Paul, I think that there's also the issue that higher ed is long overdue for a disruption. Even though the faculty do cutting edge research, the institutions themselves are 19th century, essentially, in their organisms, maybe early 20th century. I mean, they are so behind in terms of reimagining how they operate. And so to me, part of this, what's just happened, has been thrusting universities into the 21st century and having come to grips with their inefficiency, the amount of underutilized space they have, their extreme expense, the length of time it takes. I mean, there's so much about universities that need to be rethought and reimagined. We will still have universities 100 years from now, but they cannot be what they are now. And if they are, where they will have failed. And actually, there's a book called The Platform Revolution that's made the argument that any organization where there's high expense gatekeepers and asymmetries of knowledge are going to get flattened by platforms. Well, I think universities just got flattened by Zoom. And so the future is going to be very different, even I think 5-10 years from now, than what we've known.
There's been some comments in chat about special needs population and equity and access. I wonder if I'd like to maybe welcome either Lisa or Anna to maybe give us some insights as to how, you know, we can actually make sure or work to ensure that there's equitable access, or even also design spaces during this pandemic we're facing for special needs population. You know, I'm just wondering, in K through 12, I'm sure they're grappling with students with autism and all kinds of behavioral issues. And I just wonder if, you know, how we can grapple with those, even in higher ed too, you know, to ensure that we're supporting those populations and there's equitable access to education.
I think I don't really have a lot of insights into that thought, but I think one thing, you know, I've heard that some universities open up like a mobile health and counseling, like guidance, you know, guidance counselor, kind of like in a mobile, you know, so they go to wherever the students need them to go, you know, which is, you know, appropriate in this time. But I think they are concerned that they may not reach all of the students, and also they're concerned about the cost of kind of like, you know, having them going to like, you know, a lot of homes to help some students. So, you know, I haven't heard like a really good solution in terms of how you deal with special need population, the student population, you know, in terms of supporting them, either mental health or other kind, you know, and, you know, they have like a Zoom, like a virtual meeting or counseling hour, but, you know, is that effective? You know, nobody knows yet.
Yeah, I think I concur with a lot of what Anna was saying. I mean, I think that I think even in the K-12 model, I mean, I think we're going to see a lot of, we got to get ahead of this, because we're going to see a lot of disparity. You know, we're going to see bigger disparities. You know, I think there was a comment, was it Adam that you maybe right before breakout, he mentioned something about being a K-12 parent. I don't know if that was you, Adam, so I apologize if I just, okay, I was there. And then I saw you had a new comment here. But, you know, I think I don't know, we've got to figure this out, because it's going to be crucial in 10 years from now, when we do have incoming freshmen, and what that
Yeah.
experience is. So.
Yeah, even in St. Paul Public Schools, 1/3 of the teachers are in high-risk populations. The superintendent said if they were really to implement all of the protocols, they would have to hire 1,200 additional staff. And there's just no way to do that. There's no way for a public institution to do that with already diminished budget. I don't know how it works out.
It seems to me that isn't all of this telling us that what we need, I mean, redesign, which I think, Michael, you'd mentioned it earlier, right? It's just that the constraints are different than, or maybe different and enhanced from what we have had before. The last example that gets repeated a lot of times in accessibility is the fact that when we made curb cuts for people on wheelchairs, it actually helped a whole lot of other people because that design was aimed to serve, the people who needed it most at the time, strollers and all of that. So couldn't we be thinking about that same kind of aspect, that where we really focus on the people, the needs of people that need it the most right now in terms of accessibility, but it's also a shift towards mass customization, which I think, Tom, you brought up at other points, which is it's a mind shift. It's not about creating one platform or one solution that we hope works for everybody, but thinking about sort of core set of designs and then customizing from that. And that is a huge design challenge, but that's what it seems like this time is calling us for. And maybe none of us individually knows how to do it, but collectively we would. And I feel like I saw that in our class this summer, that teams of students were really honing in on design solutions that were breaking out of the box, So I'll end here, but pass it on back to Abby. But this group here with its interdisciplinary perspectives, to me, feels like the hope for the future.
Yes.
I agree. I actually think what we're doing here is the university of the future. I think that this kind of conversation may in fact be what classes and courses are like. Lots of generations, lots of diversity, and lots of points of view. So, Abby.
Thank you so much, Tom and Virajita. I'd like to welcome, let you know that the next session is actually focused on outdoor spaces, and Virajita is going to be the session host for that. And that's a session we have in September. So please come back and attend that. And these forums have been helpful for us to grapple with and discuss the issues we're facing during this global pandemic. I would like to hand it over back to Anna, and then she'll hand it over to Lisa to have some concluding thoughts, and then we can wrap up because we have like 1 more minute.
Yeah, Abby, I just wanted to mention Laura Masaccio will be one of the session leaders for next time, and she's on this call too.
Yes, and she's a professor in landscape architecture.
Thank you.
So, I mean, along the lines of what the doctor mentioned, Paul mentioned earlier on, this pandemic is going to be with us for a very long time. I mean, I don't want to be negative, but it seems like we're seeing innovative use of outdoor spaces. So the next session focuses on that. Yeah.
I have a question before, this is Marvin Meltzer. I have a question before we leave. Having total confidence, I know this is about teaching and about the university. I have total confidence that the University of Minnesota School of Design will produce brilliant students who will solve all these problems. It would really be helpful to me, and I think to a lot of people in the real world, if there were projects that would deal with, for instance, some of the issues that we have in New York City about how you change so many of these buildings, whether they're residential or commercial, and how you make them work in this time of pandemic and under CDC guidelines. I think that, in my mind, this is a whole entire new area of design or redesign, and I think it's going to take some very, very clever young people to use their minds to get this to work. And I realize it might not be in the framework of what we're talking about, but living in New York and knowing what it's done to New York and what still has to be done, if there could be some focus, if these young people could somehow look for ways to solve these, it would be an enormous contribution to major cities like New York.
That's a very great point, Marvin. And I just wanted to comment on that to let you know that, you know, many studios in our college focus on service learning or community-based projects. As a matter of fact, you know, Birajita and Tom and I have been working with a county this whole summer, Ramsey County, working with them. When the pandemic happened, they wanted to redesign their service. And we have some students working with us on that project as well. We're hoping to carry forward and work with like a rural county in the fall. But, you know, it's been interesting grappling with their library spaces and their government buildings. But, you know, that's a great idea. And we have an interior design program. I'm going to put a plug for the program and faculty in. You know, courses focus on adaptive reuse, and we oftentimes work with community on projects. So I think it's a wonderful idea that you're suggesting, Marvin, and to make the university relevant, I think it's a huge plus for us to be working on problems and issues in the community during this pandemic. I know we're out of time, but you know, it's okay if people want to stay a little bit to continue the dialogue, but I just want to be mindful of that. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank
Tom,
you.
Tom, good to see you.
Good to see you, Marvin.
You.
You look great. You look great. You're getting younger, I think, right?
I wish.
No, you're okay.
Anna
You're okay.
and Lisa as well. We appreciate
Yeah, Elisa and Anna, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
it.
It was
Thank
great.
you so much.
And then on the
Thank you.
screen is the next session. Yeah. We're having people log off.
I have to.
Thank you all.
Roger,
Great webinar.
yeah,
Appreciate it.
thank you.
You, Robert.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Roger,
Bye-bye.
that we have to go grading.
Yes.
So we're going to have to leave. Wish I could stay, but I got to
Good luck.
go
Good
grade.
luck. Good luck.